Welcome back to Close Up and our extended conversation with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Senator, thank you for coming in this morning.
Nice to be here.
Let's talk about this decision that has sent a political shockwave through New Hampshire. You're not going to seek another term when this one ends at the end of 2026. Why do this right when you have the chance, potentially, if Democrats retake the Senate, to become the chair of Senate Foreign Relations? A big passion for you.
Well, it is, and I had really mixed feelings. I struggled with this decision. It was not easy, but I've been involved in politics now for 50 years in New Hampshire. By the end of my term, I will have served in elective office for 30 years. So I think it's time. It's time to think about what else I might want to do. I'm not going to leave trying to make a difference in New Hampshire and still be engaged, but it will be nice to have a little more flexibility and to do some other things.
We don't officially have a primary to succeed you, but those moves are being made. You endorsed Chris Pappas in 2018 in a very competitive and crowded primary for the 1st Congressional District. This is a somewhat similar situation shaping up right now for your seat. Is the door open right now to an endorsement for Congressman Pappas to kind of settle this thing before it even gets started?
Well, we want to see how this plays out a little bit. Obviously, I haven't usually endorsed in primaries, and I would expect to support the nominee, whoever that is, and do everything I can to help get them elected. I think it's important to hold on to the seat. I think it's important as we think about the direction of New Hampshire and the country.
3 open seats for the Democrats to defend at the federal level, especially when the party appears to be somewhat directionless. That could be problematic for you guys.
Well, it's not clear that there will be 3 open seats, so I think we have to see how things play out a little bit.
Do you think former Governor Chris Sununu would be a formidable candidate? I mean, polls show him leading right now in these theoretical matchups. He's warmed to Trump a little bit and said he likes what Elon Musk is doing in Washington.
Well, former Governor Sununu has always been a formidable candidate, but I think somebody who endorses what President Trump is doing right now with the tariffs, what Elon Musk and the Doge boys are doing with indiscriminate firings, with cutting agencies, with looking at Social Security, with talking about reducing Medicaid dramatically, I don't think that's going to be a popular position.
When I was telling people I was going to do this interview, the number one thing people wanted to ask me about was the fact that you were making fun of Scott Brown's hair last week. They were saying this is a little unlike you to do that.
Well, it wasn't making fun. I was just pointing out, as people were asking me about, Scott Brown has raised concerns about age in this campaign. I pointed out that, unlike Scott Brown, I don't color my hair.
So you felt turnabout was fair play in this case?
I do.
Okay.
And, come on. Be willing to laugh at yourself, Scott Brown.
Democrats were portrayed by the Trump campaign in this last election cycle as being pro-illegal immigration, pro-crime, and anti-girls sports. Proved to be a pretty potent combination there for swing voters. Do you think Democrats need to moderate on those issues and recalibrate in order to win again?
Well, I don't think most Democrats I know believe we need a secure border, southern border, believe we need comprehensive immigration reform, believe that we need to support our law enforcement agencies. I certainly did that as governor and have done that in the United States Senate, and believe that states can decide how to deal with sports on their own. They don't need the federal government interfering. You
don't think, though, there was a deluge of these online ads and things like that, targeting a lot of male voters saying, hey, the Democrats want your daughter to shower with a man. This was an effective attack.
Well, when you spend $40 billion, you do make a difference. But I don't think most people think that those are the critical issues that we're facing in this country. The fact is, Donald Trump, in his campaign, said he was going to do something about grocery prices. He was going to do something about inflation. He was going to do something about high energy costs. He was going to do something about the cost of rental housing, and he was going to address mortgage rates. He was going to end the war in Ukraine on the first day. He has done none of those things. What he has done is looked at retribution against people he considers his enemies. He's come in and he's made indiscriminate cuts in the bureaucracy in Washington in ways that don't show any rhyme or reason for what we really need to do if we're going to address being more efficient and more effective. He has they're talking about firing between 70 and 80,000 people in the VA, and we know that veterans make up a higher percentage of our federal employees than any other category of people. So I don't think that's what people signed on for when they voted for Donald Trump in November. And I think people are making their voices known now that they don't like what's going on in Washington under this president.
One last question on this recalibration potentially for Democrats. You know, Democrats keep saying, well, we don't think that the transgender sports issue is one that is national, and yet they keep voting against what 80% of the country believes. Is it fair when a formerly male athlete wins a girls' sports championship, say in like high jump?
No, that's not fair. But what I'm saying is I don't think that's the issue that most people are concerned about as they're going to the polls. I think what they're concerned about is what's happening in their own lives. Are their kids able to get a good education? Are they going to be able to have their health care? Are they going to be able to afford their groceries? Are they going to be able to pay their rent and find housing? And all of that is on the line, and this president has done nothing to address any of those issues.
A lot of Democratic base anger right now, and it's materializing in these town halls. They want Democrats to fight back harder against the Trump administration. What are you telling your longtime supporters who may be upset with that vote for the continuing resolution?
That if you didn't like the continuing resolution, you for sure wouldn't like a government shutdown, because everything that's in that continuing resolution could be done in a government shutdown, and a lot worse. I don't think we want to give Donald Trump, who has the biggest megaphone in the country, the ability to say to the rest of the country, well, we are in this economic mess because of what the Democrats did to shut down the government. I think we are in this economic mess because of the decisions that President Trump is making about tariffs, about the uncertainty that he's created, about the chaos that he's created in Washington, about the layoffs that he's doing. And I want to keep people focused on that. We have air traffic controllers in New Hampshire who should not be worried about whether they're going to get paid and be able to pay their rent when they're trying to land our planes safely. We have thousands of women and kids in New Hampshire who need their WIC program so that they can eat. Shut down the government and they're not going to have any of that. None of the federal employees here are going to get the paychecks that they need to keep going. And the people who are dependent on those programs are not going to have that. Now, I understand the frustration. I'm as frustrated as anybody. But you have to think about how to best address the concerns and not just cut off your nose to spite your face. And I think that's what shutting down the government would have done when there was no guarantee that it could ever be opened up. And what we would have given was a free pass to Elon Musk and his Doge boys to do anything they wanted in any agency to any program without any oversight at all.
What are you hearing from local businesses here about the impact of the Canadian tariffs?
They're very worried. I was at C&J Limousine yesterday. He's had to cancel more than half of his bus order for new buses that are made in Canada because he's concerned about the additional cost. I was up north on Wednesday in the North Country talking to Littleton town officials who were talking about visitors coming down to New Hampshire who they're concerned are not going to be here, about small businesses that are worried that and are not expanding because they're worried about the inability to have the relationship that they've had with Canada.
It'll be interesting to see how that one plays out, particularly the tourism, with some of those Canadian officials say don't even go to the United States.
Right.
So, Senator Shaheen, thank you for your time here on CloseUp. We'll have you back
always.
a few more times. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it. All right, and we'll be right back with the debate over a housing bill in Concord that got state senators out of their partisan trenches. Stay with us.